Anselm was born about 30 years before the Normans invaded England, 1033. His family were minor nobility on the way down, and he was born in a small rural town in Italy called Aosta. There wasn't much of anything interesting about the town at all. We don't know a lot about his early life. We do know that he was very close to his mother, and that when she died, he was left living with a father with whom he was violently incompatible. So eventually he left a long while. He wandered in Europe, and he fetched up in the monastery of Bec in 1059, where he entered and became a monk. The next 17 or so years of his life were really the only period in which he was entirely happy. He liked the monastic life. He liked teaching his fellow monks. He liked talking about philosophy and theology with them. Those are really things he would have been very happy to spend the rest of his life doing. He did not like administration. He was not very good at it. I think that makes him the patron saint of philosophers. But he was pressed to become abbot of Bec, and there his troubles began, because he was not, as I said, very good at it, nor was he entirely popular at it. So his life as abbot of Bec was not nearly as peaceful and happy as his life had been as simply a teacher and a monk. However, as abbot of Bec, he did eventually come to the attention of the Norman aristocracy, who of course had in the meanwhile taken over England. So eventually, when they were looking for an Archbishop of Canterbury, their eyes lighted on Anselm. Now there's some controversy about exactly what Anselm felt about becoming Archbishop. The records we have tell us that he protested violently. If we're to take them as face value, he was literally dragged to the altar to be consecrated and had the crozier pressed into his hand. Some people at the time and some people since have questioned whether his protestations were entirely sincere. I'm inclined to take the man at face value. Maybe it's just because I'm a philosopher and the last thing I'd want to be is Archbishop of Canterbury. But in any event, he wound up becoming that. A while afterward, he wrote a letter to somebody in which he wrote, "Anselm, Archbishop of Canterbury, by the ordinance or permission of God." Now, if you're a theologian, you understand what he was packing into that salutation. The things ordains are the good things. The things God ordains are the good things. The things he permits are the bad things. So some while afterwards, Anselm is still saying, I do not at all think that this is obviously a good thing that I'm Archbishop. Given how his archbishopric went, it's not so surprising that he would have that sort of mixed feeling about it. Anselm was involved in heated controversy with two kings of England, which led to his spending a good deal of his life in exile from his archbishopric and from England. The controversies were very broadly over the liberty of the church. The king wanted to have the ability to name or not name bishops as he pleased. That was not just a matter of sort of, I'm the king, I want to do these things. If the king could keep the archbishoprics and bishoprics empty, he could appropriate the revenues that would go to those things and put them in the royal treasury, and that was a very good thing if you wanted to be a rich king and wage wars and so on. Anselm, however, defended the rights of the church, and so, as I said, he had a very unhappy archiepiscopal career. Okay, Anselm gave as sort of the slogan he lived by, faith seeking understanding. That was really what he was about in all of his writings. Now, that particular slogan tells us a lot about how he went about it. First, he started from the standpoint of faith. Anselm was not a secular philosopher trying to convince people that Christianity were true. He was a Christian starting from the assumption that Christianity was true. When he said faith seeking understanding, what he was looking for were the reasons it was true, why Christian doctrine has the shape it does. Often, that took in Anselm the form of looking for a sort of an abstract, rational demonstration of certain Christian tenets. Sometimes he would base this on other Christian tenets. And the idea there was, well, if you can sort of show how one thing implies another, you're giving the bones underneath the soft flesh of Christian theology, the real reasons it hangs together. But sometimes, searching for the reason why something was true could look an awful lot like trying to prove it in the abstract to, say, an atheist who didn't believe it. You see this particularly in his book, The Proslogium. There, Anselm sets out the book, and his own title for the book was Faith Seeking Understanding. So he started, as the in the standpoint of a Christian, and he writes the book in the standpoint of somebody praying to God. So it looks like a work of devotion, yet that is where he gives his most famous argument for the existence of God. Why? This is faith seeking understanding of why the faith is true, and that extends even to, can you give a reason that shows why it's true that God exists? So while he's looking as a faithful person for the understanding of his faith, he often gives what can also serve as arguments trying to prove the faith to an unbeliever. This also is explicitly the sort of the twofold task he undertakes in his book Credeus Homo. He is a Christian there seeking for the understanding of his faith, but he says, I'm going to operate as if Christ never existed. I'm going to show why there's a rational necessity for God to have done these things this way. I'm not going to assume that Christ came and that Christ died for our sins. I'm going to start from some more basic assumptions and show, given some basic thoughts about God, that God pretty much would have had to do this and do it this way. So what was at one level a project in Christian theology can, from another level, and equally truly, be looked at as one of the most audacious attempts to rationally demonstrate the truth of Christianity that's ever been undertaken. Okay, next thing to take up is Anselm's intellectual context. One thing that's worth mentioning is that much of his writing was done either as an active monk teaching other monks or as the Archbishop of Canterbury. As a monk, he was addressing people who shared his faith and daily life, and there was a common life that arose out of. As Archbishop, very often he was squeezing his work as a philosopher and as a theologian into the corners that were freed up when he didn't have administrative cares. So his output perhaps was not as great as Archbishop as it might have been. Now, another way you can look at a person's intellectual context is by asking what influenced the person. It's astonishing to us who, let's say an undergraduate might easily own several hundred books, and on the internet you have easy access to thousands at the click. It's astonishing to us to realize, going back to Anselm's days, how little he had to work with. At that point, a library of 200 books would have considered grand on the scale of the entire European continent. So you as an undergraduate may well own more books than the larger libraries in Europe owned in Anselm's day. We know to some detail what books he had access to both in Bec and at Canterbury, because we have library catalogs that have somehow survived from back then, not exactly during Anselm's time, but not long afterwards. So we know what he would have had available to read. It really wasn't all that much. In the way of philosophy, he had a couple of books of Aristotle's, the Categories and the De Interpretatione. He had access to Boethius and his commentaries on some works of Aristotle. And as far as straight philosophy goes, that's almost all Anselm had to read. In theology, his preeminent influence was Augustine. Augustine was the most authoritative theologian in the West at that time and for a long time afterwards. And he had good access to Augustine's work. So it's fair to say that when you look at the broad contours of Anselm's theology, it's pretty much straight Augustinian. Also, he took over some large-scale philosophical ideas from Augustine, a broadly Neoplatonic way of thinking about God and reality that he could have gotten nowhere else given what he had to read. Within that framework, though, it's really surprising how independent and original a mind he had. Augustine, for example, is known for the view that evil is somehow non-being. In other words, the good things are the things that are. The bad things are the things that aren't there but should have been. Example that's often used is that sight is good, blindness is a lack of sight, and blindness is a bad thing. Anselm was willing to apply that analysis to some bad things, but he is very plain saying that there are some exceptions. One of the exceptions is pain. It's very hard to convince yourself that pain is something that isn't there, or that the badness of pain is something that isn't there. Pain seems to intrude itself as something very positive on your awareness, and Anselm just says, yes, that's right. So he doesn't say, I'm disagreeing with Augustine, but he does very quietly disagree with Augustine. Again, on the understanding of human freedom, Augustine was a sort of theological determinist. In other words, Augustine held to a very strong doctrine of predestination, and as part of that, he held that God preordained everything you will ever do. You didn't really have freedom in any of your actions. Anselm although he did hold to a form of predestination, did not agree with Augustine on that. Anselm was a libertarian about freedom. He believed that you very often have the ability to do otherwise, and that your actions really come ultimately from you, not from God, particularly the bad ones. So if you look at the details of Anselm, you find he's not Augustinian in all areas. In the broad outline he is, but he's a very independent mind about the details within that structure.